There's absolutely no reason why attributing purpose to organisms is non-scientific. That's rubbish. We are effectively saying not only are organisms purposive, and evidently so, but very interestingly, as physiologists, we know also that a purposive explanation actually predicts downwards towards the molecular level as to what kinds of mechanisms must exist for that purpose to exist than the other way round. What is interesting here is that purposive explanations actually lead to good science. What is this doing? Why does it consume 20% of the total energy that we use? It's got nothing to do with whether there's something ghostly out there that, as it were, is a goal that is somewhere out there dragging us towards something. That sort of causation is not involved. All it's postulating is that there is anticipation of what might happen in the future. And that has nothing to do with backward time causation or anything ghostly like that. All it's got to have, any organism, is the ability to anticipate very many different reactions rapidly to crisis situations. And that can only be done by having an anticipatory process occurring inside here.
Consciousness to me is like a readiness, if you like, to act, and thereby anticipatory. And it goes back to what Denis was saying earlier, that the key thing there is anticipation. It's a state of readiness and anticipating what it is that's going on in the world, regardless of whether we're right about it. We cannot function without that. And that is consciousness. You don't.
And that is demonstrated, isn't it? There are what are called readiness potentials in the nervous system that have been recorded as inevitably what happens when you are in the process of making a decision. It's fascinating. It really is. They are readiness potentials. The system is getting itself geared up, and we feel that consciously too.
It is. Well, that is the feeling. That is the consciousness, Dennis.
That is the consciousness.
And,
Yes,
but you know, I can say something. I'll say something really highly controversial now. Something that Denis and I have been discussing more recently.
Ray,
Yes.
Denis, is there anything particular you'd like me to touch on while we go through this conversation?
One of the things that I've been thinking more about in recent times, as Denis knows, and Denis and I have had discussions about, and of course, you must understand that we never have closed minds, Denis and I, on anything. I mean, our whole approach is to try and be as open to ideas as possible, because it seems to us that the only way you can begin to understand, particularly problems like the mind-body issue, is to be open to ideas. What we've been doing is sort of focusing on, I think it's fair to say, on one or two areas that I think are somewhat mistaken in approach, if you like. We may be wrong on that and corrected, but one of those is that the idea of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon, that it depends, as it were, on higher order functionality. And our approach to that is more, as we've expressed in one of our papers, in terms of a title of one of our papers, emergent. It's just simply, actually, you can remove the word a altogether. It's mergent. And it's mergent through levels and across levels, if you see what I mean. Within levels, it's mergent as well. There's a mergence going on. And that mergence, we feel, is something which is true of all cells. It's as true of unicellular organisms as it is of higher level, a horrible word, higher, more complex, more organized entities. Multicellularity, for example, will involve some kind of coming together of what we would normally look at in relation to individual organisms, unicellular organisms, as what I believe you could refer to as conscious, in the sense that is to do with the state of being of that organism in relation to its readiness, if you like, to respond. And they are conditional states. So in a sense, consciousness is a conditional state. And conditional states exist, although with different levels of faculty. What has evolved as a result in large part of that motivational consciousness, if you like, that changing of states and responsiveness are the different faculties that we see in all sorts of forms of life. And life has explored different ways of being engaged with the problem of maintaining its integrity. So I think that sort of encapsulates, I think, where our thoughts are. I mean, Denis might want to correct some points, but I think that really sums up where we are. But we're not closed, if you see what I mean. I mean, one of the things that we're probably more closed about is the idea that there is a mind-body separation, as it were.
Yes, the dichotomy.
That's another aspect that I think we think is mistaken, and it leads to all sorts of problems of regarding organisms as sort of mechanistic, not just material. I don't think there's a problem with regarding it as material, but that's different from regarding it as mechanistic. And it was the change to looking at or life as mechanistic that I think created all the problems back in the Western sense in terms of the Enlightenment and so on, that for some reason we wanted humans to be different and started to treat organisms, other forms of life, as being simply material in a mechanistic sense. And it led to another kind of dualism. I'm sorry, I'm banging on here, but I just want to get you to feel of where our thoughts, I think, lie. It led to another kind of dualism, which we've referred to, which is a mechanistic dualism. In other words, you look for the bit within the system that is driving the system. And we don't think there is a bit within the system that drives the system. The system drives the system. That's the whole essence of life. It's the distinctive feature of living organisms. So I think that's where we are. And then, of course, on top of that, the idea that we've kind of developed over the years is this idea that the system at its different nested levels, nested functionality, from the cells to the tissues to the organs to the organ systems and so on, and to the body and to the social interactions and the interspecies interactions, the ecological, leads to different levels of intelligence, if you like, different ways of using information about what's going on. So cells will influence cells and communicate it with each other. It's absolutely vital to the functionality. And a lot of that has got lost, we feel, in medicine, actually, that we've stopped looking for the way the system controls itself and the way that control of itself can be a fundamental in what goes wrong with health. And then, of course, you reach the sort of this rather more outer level, if you like, which we regard that is regarded as the psychological self, if you like, which creates all the sort of problems of the mind-body, which is, of course, how on earth can this apparently immaterial aspect of our lives influence the material? And of course, in a sense, it's not as immaterial as people think it is. And that's the key there, I think, that there's no, and it's an open system, of course, it's exchanging. What is fundamental about that outer layer, that outer cultural level, if you like, psychosocial cultural level, is that it is what exists beyond the materiality of us as individuals, and therefore has a kind of spiritualism, if you see what I mean, but without a dualism. It has a spiritualism in the sense that there is some aspect of maintaining the integrity of the system that is not necessarily the maintaining of us personally. And that is, I think, a crucial understanding. And in a sense, we commune with that as part of it. Some people ask me when I express this that, are you talking about panpsychism? I don't know whether I am or not. I don't think there's any need necessarily to sort of label it, but I understand why they ask that question. Depending on how one defines a psychological state, there are certainly social states And those social states are to do with the way we behave as ensemble, as groups, as opposed to as individuals. And it's not just simply an aggregate of individual behavior. What happens when we behave as groups, that becomes a kind of a communion, a different way of communicating. We don't have to do what we're doing now, which is to explain ourselves to each other when we're behaving in that kind of way. In fact, the vast majority of us, we just don't have time to do that. We behave in that way. We create psychocultural norms, if you like, in terms of normative behavior, and they will differ from culture to culture, different kinds of cultures, and over time they will change in responsiveness as a way of solving the problems. I'm going on far too much, but I think I think that encapsulates where we are. I suppose. Sorry, I went on a bit long with that, and you probably didn't.
Ray, that's
there are so many aspects to it. It's not surprising, therefore, that I think that people can get so muddled over it all, including us.
And I think it's great because it shows your passion towards the topic. Dennis, anything about what Ray just mentioned that you'd like to add on or clarify?
I don't think I need to. No, I mean, the fact is that we can finish each other's sentences. I mean, this is a ridiculous communion. It's true. I mean, ever since ages ago, we know where the mind is going of the other one.
Yes.
We could easily finish I was waiting to finish any of those sentences. No. We've got this pins down where we are, and you might as well begin whenever you want, Tevin.
Look, I think the best place to start, you guys have both been in this field for such a long time, and over the last few years, I've noticed a nice shift or transition into the philosophical aspects of it all, sort of bringing this all. And I appreciate that because it fits then perfectly within this podcast. Because as a doctor, someone who's deeply ingrained within biology, physiology, I'm very fascinated personally by the philosophical elements that our work entails. And I want to first start with definitions, guys. So let's try and define your philosophical idea of the mind-body problem, and obviously the problem of this mind-matter dichotomy already. And thereafter, let's define life and consciousness. Anyone can start.
I'll do a beginning. I think I come from a long period of interacting with a number of very good philosophers, and it's been a privilege to interact with them. And I think what I've come round to are two things that matter. One is that many have felt that given the way biology was developing in the 20th century under the influence of Francis Crick's central dogma and various gene-centric interpretations, that they somehow had to position the mind in a completely determinist world. And I don't think it's possible. And, I've discussed this with, for example, Anthony Kenny many times. He did his best as a philosopher to approach these questions, accepting that biology had shown that it's a determinate world. Well, it just ain't. That's the first thing. There is massive stochasticity. There is almost virtual impossibility, computational explosion and all of that to account for things in determinate models. So that's the first big thing I would say. And the second thing they did was therefore to become too captivated by the need to either go with Descartes or against him. And we don't see the need to bother with that argument at all. That would be my gloss on the way Ray began. Yes.
Ray, anything about that you'd like to add on?
Yes, just to continue on from that aspect of the stochasticity, the variability, the almost unpredictable variability at that very basic level, is that nothing can work without that. If it is both a problem for life and the reason for life, in a sense. And what the system does, as we express it, is that it harnesses that energy from that stochasticity, from that variability, to create the things it needs to create in order to solve the problems it needs to solve in order to maintain its integrity. The distinctive feature of life, I think, is that there is this self-maintenance of integrity. It doesn't do that by remaining the same. It does it by adaptation, by change at various stages and times. So it can have an adaptation which is transgenerationally in response to longer term changes. And it can have, which unfortunately the sort of modern view put aside, because it had this inherent view of inheritance of acquired characteristics, as it were. In other words, the use of information in one generation to solve the problems in the future, knowing in a sense that you can't solve them immediately. But if some of you can, if there is sufficient variability within the system for the systems to explore different ways of dealing with a problem, you can develop faculty. And that leads me to another distinction, which is the distinction between, and it's not an absolute distinction, I'll come back to that in a moment, but a distinction between the development of faculty on the one hand, both in terms of development and also in terms of evolution, the ability to do something, and what one does with it, which I will call facultative. So the distinction between faculty on the one hand and facultative. And if you focus just on the faculty, you end up with kind of just looking at the anatomy and physiology, if you like. I mean, here is it's beautiful, no doubt. I mean, look at it. These are my fingers and my hands and my arms. And if you look at the fantastic relationship between the muscles and the skeleton and how it works, or if you look at organisms that are arthropods, for example, the extraordinary beauty of the arrangements that they've got to do similar kinds of things, which is to move. The reason why these are there to move is not so much inherent in the faculty, but in the facultative. In other words, what are you doing with them? And in a sense, these are tools of the system. Society, the scientists don't seem to have much problem. If I point to a hammer and say, you know, that hammer is used to knock nails in and hold things together, or that screwdriver is designed to unscrew things, or whatever, an implement that has been made in order to do something because it's created to do something, then you can see reason in it. And this is important, reason. See, reason is, as it were, the non-material bit, because it's the situational logic. Why has that been created? It's been created in order to solve the particular problem of holding things together or unscrewing things or doing things that we need to do. What's really odd is the fact that here I have this pencil, which I use to write down notes. I'm going to be doing it while we're talking in case I need to make a note of something. And it's a curious kind of thing that somehow or other they want us to divorce the idea that this has reason behind it, but this hand that uses it doesn't. And it makes no sense to me because this cannot do anything without this. And this can't do very much without this, you see. So I don't know what happens to science when it's somehow or other, the more it gets into this, the more it becomes hard and says, oh, you know, you can't have reason. You can't have why. You can't. And of course, one of the difficulties of why is that you can't measure it. I mean, the why is certainly immaterial in that sense. It's not something that can be clearly weighed on a scale. I mean, what is half a reason? I don't know, you see. So it's terribly difficult to partition and sort of say what it is. What it is, of course, is the situational logic, and that situational logic is created in large part by us, by life. Life is both problem solving and problem creating. So it creates the reason, The reason, we don't have to create some reason from somewhere else. It's a Plato kind of, Platonic kind of sense of, there's an ideal out there, if only we could find it. And the philosophers, of course, have the skill of being able to tell us what it is. That somehow or other, the essences of being what we are. And if only we knew what they were, we'd know the real Ray Noble, you see, is the essence of me. And this kind of concept of an essence of, that really drives the system, it either leads you to the hard materialistic view or mechanistic view of the, it's the genome. I mean, I've seen people refer to Aristotle's view of the soul as being almost like the genome, which I think is bonkers. It's not like that at all. And in fact, he saw some of the fundamental problems with dualism, which is, again, how do you partition it? I mean, how do you, if you have a faculty to act, why are you creating a faculty for the faculty to act? Why can't the faculty act without there being a faculty for the faculty to act, you see? And I mean, you can find that in Aristotle's writings as well, you see. And so why do we need a genome in order to act? In order to, no gene is involved in this when I'm using my pencil. And no gene certainly determines what it is I'm thinking when I'm writing on a piece of paper with it. I mean,
it's very important to clarify there, Ray, just to interrupt a moment.
Yes.
Very important to clarify there is that it does take time to change gene expression levels. So there is inevitably a block on being able, if you're doing something quickly, like playing the piano, no genes are varying during that. And indeed, the heartbeat, which is what I modeled many years ago, there's no time for gene expression to change during each heartbeat. That's something that people seem to have missed. Largely, I think, because Dawkins is so utterly convincing with his simplistic explanations of a gene-centric view. But once you abandon that and realize that there's massive stochasticity, even at the molecular level, that, of course, comes from the water-based system, which has naturally got huge stochasticity. We'll never model all the trillions of water molecules there are even in a single cell, let alone doing it in a whole body. So I keep coming back to that fact that we have to recognize that organisms are operating within an effectively infinite space of possibility.
I love the fact that I know, Dennis, when you speak about this whole issue, you talk about how if someone can create an artificial intelligence, it'll be more impressive when they make one out of water, because then they've basically
exactly so. I think it would be necessary, because I can't otherwise. You see, their answer would be, look, Dennis, you've made a huge fundamental mistake. The software is not dependent on the hardware. And I say, well, wait a minute. What are organisms? They're not software dependent on the hardware. They are integrative wholes. There is no distinction like that. What is true is that what you sometimes refer to as the hardware, the genes and the proteins they can create, are immensely fluid. We know, for example, that the proteins can multitask. You can have a protein that goes into a membrane and acts as a channel, and the same protein can be an enzyme in a different context. And most proteins are like that. We know now about 70% have got variable. Well, what has happened is easy to understand too. It was shown in the first sequencing of the human genome in 2001. If you compare the different species for a particular type of protein, let's say it's a chromatin, and you look at what's happened, bits are being added on. There's been accretion of functional bits. But that means that sometimes in a complex protein, there may be 7 or 8 functional bits that can be used for that purpose or this purpose. And they can be totally different, as different between controlling iron moving in and out of a cell membrane in a red cell, or enabling a aconitase to do the enzymatic work that it's doing. It's as different as that. You know, so we've got to recognize that there's a much more fluid situation that life encounters. And that's true even in a single cell. If I represent a nucleotide as the size of my fist, and here in Oxford, it's the nucleus, the edge of the cell will be way up in Scotland. It's that huge.
It's quite astonishing when you think about, when you guys think about the current state of biology, where do you think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding with, you brought up Dawkins, and he's played a huge role with his Selfish Gene book and the way people are able to absorb that book because the content's quite accessible. Where do you think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding with how we perceive concepts like life or mind?
Sad to say, it's the unfortunate interpretations of molecular biology. There are several key facts that just don't fit with the current theories. First, DNA does not replicate like a crystal. It does not self-replicate. It relies on the organism itself to be able to correct many errors in the replication process. Second, there is no Weissman barrier. There is what's the word we use sometimes, Ray? The boundary between the soma and the germline, yes, but it's a functional boundary. And we know that control RNAs can just pass across that very readily. We know that many examples of that. I know a paper that I published with a colleague just last year, or 2023, we're now 2025. 2023, I think. Anyway, it simply shows the many examples of little vesicles of RNAs and control proteins and so on crossing that boundary. So Weissman barrier, I'm afraid, is gone. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Well, we're now then into the epigenetic area, and here again is a major fault. What Richard, I think, would say is, okay, some of that is an honorary gene. He uses that expression actually in his debates with people. Oh, yes, I'll accept that as an honorary gene. But once you do that, you're changing the definition of a gene such that the whole theory becomes a tautology. There is no way you can test it experimentally. And that, I'm afraid, is true of the selfish gene theory. He's very clever. He's produced a structure that seems to make extraordinary sense if you stay within it. But as soon as you realize DNA does not replicate like a crystal, that there is no Weissman barrier, and that inheritance of acquired characteristics can occur through epigenetics, and we can go into the detail of any of those if we need to, but those are the three main things that are just misinterpretations of the molecular biology. And believe you me, over the last 20 years, we've furrowed in that area to such a degree. When I put all of those points to Richard Dawkins 2 years ago in a debate at the Institute of Art and Ideas Festival, he didn't answer any of those. He simply repeated his mantra, genes are causal. Genes are causal, and genes are causal because we can measure an association between the two. To a physiologist, association can be zero, and it can still be causal.
That's right, Dennis. And I think there has also been a fundamental reaching out to your philosophers now. There's also been a fundamental philosophical error made, I think. And it goes back to what we were saying a little bit earlier, that that if you, there's a concept that if you abandon materialism, that you're suggesting that there is something which is supernatural.
Yes, exactly.
And what we've tried to do is to show people that this is not necessarily the case at all. That reason is not supernatural; it is natural. It's the only way nature can work, because all organisms, we say in our little book, Understanding Living Systems, all organisms have to assess their environment, and they do so by sensing it, but also by anticipating it. all organisms are dynamically engaged in their environment and continuously assessing it. Now, perhaps in the simplest of organisms, unicellular organisms, that assessment is relatively simple, although actually, when you look at it, it's rather complex. And it involves an enormous amount of changing of state and exploratory behavior. And you know, as you going back to this idea that as it were, systems are nested within each other, organelles are nested within the cells and the cell's integrative function, and each cell is nested within in multicellular organisms. And multicellular organisms may have come together in a sense through the same kind of variabilities that exist within the cells themselves, that, you know, cells will come together, merge to create new organisms. And in the early period of evolution, that may have been a fundamental in determining the way different species were created, until what we see now are very much more definitive species and groups. But the sort of symbiotic relationships that can exist. But going back to this philosophical thing, I think another mistake that the selfish gene makes is regarding the gene as an immutable bit. Richard makes a great deal of this in The Selfish Gene itself, in the book. This always reminds me a little of Plato's idea, if you like, of, you know, that there has to be some pure thing that maintains itself, that isn't, and of course the problem with being is the fact that it's continually changing. The world is full of flux. So what on earth should it be? What is the essence of being a horse or a dog or a cat or a human being or a chair or whatever? And of course, it isn't like that. There isn't a system that exists outside determining what it is that it should be. But curiously, I think that Richard Dawkins and others have made a similar kind of mistake, but in a mechanistic way, of saying that what it must be determined by something which is pure. And their whole mathematics, in a sense, their whole kind of maths approach to it is to assume that, you know, the whole existence is to maintain genes in a gene pool. Well, genes don't exist in a gene pool. It's a figment of imagination in any event. There isn't a gene pool. The genes are in us. Yes, you can regard us as a pool, but once you decide that they're in us and not in a gene pool, the idea of maintaining genes in a gene pool evaporates. I mean, why on earth would you want to maintain genes in a gene pool when in a gene pool they can do absolutely nothing? The only way that genes can do anything at all is by being used by systems that they exist in, which are organisms. And the crucial thing is here not to maintain the integrity of the gene, the immutability of the gene, it is to change it. And when you look at how this works in practice, the genes are, yes, they're right that genes are a problem because the errors are occurring all the time. And those errors have to be corrected. And there's a whole machinery that exists to correct those changes. If we didn't have that machinery within ourselves, we would soon fall apart. In other words, we will fail to do what organisms do, which is to maintain their integrity and their integrative function. And how they do that will change with age, because with age, we do maintain our integrity in somewhat different ways. So we have to adapt to the fact that we're not doing it in the same kind of way. When you reach the age of 70 plus, for example, you're no longer doing it by generating more brain cells, or you're not generating it by altering the synaptic sort of connections in the system, other than perhaps losing more of them and so on. So you're having to adapt to the fact that physically your faculties are not as supple or as responsive as they were before, and you adapt to them. But this is not about keeping everything the same. It's adapting and changing. And that's true at all levels. It's true as a cultural level. Cultures have to adapt, otherwise they cease to exist. And any system that seeks to say what something should be is problematic. It creates a closed system, which is then unable to adapt. And that leads us to the sort of philosophical problem at the social level. Is there a better way of being? Well, probably, but I don't know what it would be. And I think that attempts to define it probably lead to more likely breakdown of social existence than it does enhancing it, because we're dependent on the variability, not maintaining things the same. And I think this is a major philosophical mistake that the materialists made, in a sense, by honing in on the gene as the immutable bit. And thus the logic.
Immortal. That's extraordinary.
Yes.
Even called immortal, the immortal gene.
Yeah.
Not immortal at all.
Yes, that was the name he was when he was considering to name it initially, before his publishers told him to name it the selfish gene.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
I think something
and that in itself created another philosophical problem of a moral kind. Because see, it kind of, I know that Richard wouldn't have intended this to be the case, but it led to the acceptance of the notion that we are all born selfish. And this is fundamentally philosophically flawed, because you can't be selfish unless you have a choice not to be. And that is fundamental, you see. And I don't understand, you can't be regarded as selfish. As a baby cannot be regarded as selfish. I mean, all organisms, of course, as I've said, we're definitively seeking to maintain our integrity. But that in itself is not selfish. None of us could exist if we didn't do that. None of us could exist without helping each other maintain our integrity, which leads to mutualism. It leads to symbiotic activity. It leads to communal activity. It leads to social activity. It leads to give and take. It leads to a kind of morality, if you like, that is certainly fundamentally different to the concept that we're all born selfish. It also leads to situations like in packs of wolves, for example, where equity matters. Individual members of a group, of a pack in wolves, can be punished if they don't behave correctly. In other words, they don't behave for the sake of the group. But at the same time as that is the case, you've still got to have the outriders for evolution to be able to occur. You've still got to have those within the group that are going to behave differently, who are going to be slightly outside the norm. And that at the social level is also fundamentally creative. And if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to evolve culturally and adapt readily as groups. So even that moral normativeness, if you like, in wolves has variability at the edges. I mean, it will allow certain kinds of behavior which is not so conducive to maintaining the organization of the pack.
I think there's almost a beautiful mirroring here when you're talking about that sticking out and doing something creative, because you guys are doing something similar in that regard with your thought processes and trying to bring back some sort of a holistic view of everything. Do you guys find that when you approach your work, you're attacked from two sides, let's say? There's one group, let's say materialists, reductionists, because in a sense, you are not necessarily reducing us to our parts, but acknowledging the extreme layers of reality and then bringing them all back together, which is beautiful. But then that means there are going to be people out there who still call you reductionists and don't like it. And then on the flip side, the reductionists who are fundamental reductionists don't like the fact that you guys are almost bringing this holistic aspect. So you're almost stuck in the middle, kind of like politics, when someone's either extreme left, extreme right. You're kind of in this relational in the middle zone. Do you find that makes it a little bit harder to get a point across?
Well, you're putting your finger on a very important divide. So let's first of all get the divide clear. Just read page 18 of the biggest textbook of evolutionary biology, Futuma and Kirkpatrick's book, just called Evolution. Page 18 there's a I think it's page 18. I could be out by a page or two. Anyway, it's quite near the beginning. It's the only page in the book that is devoted to philosophy, and it is to dismiss it. And it ends with the statement, there is no room in science for purpose. Full stop. There's no justification, no argument as to why that statement is necessarily true. That needs exposition. It needs a philosophical argument for why that should be accepted. There's none. Now, we are effectively saying not only are organisms purposive, and evidently so, we don't really need to bother too much about precisely what that range of purpose is. We can see the purposiveness. But very interestingly, as physiologists, we know also that a purposive explanation actually predicts downwards towards the molecular level as to what kinds of mechanisms must exist for that purpose to exist than the other way round. What is interesting here is that purposive explanations actually lead to good science. Good reductionist science, if you want to call it that. That's the strange thing. So we're by making that blanket statement, as happens in Fatuma's and Kirkpatrick's book, we are actually closing off a major scientific question. What is this doing? Why does it consume 20% of the total energy that we use? It's got nothing to do with whether there's something ghostly out there that, as it were, is a goal that is somewhere out there dragging us towards something. That sort of causation is not involved. All it's postulating is that there is anticipation of what might happen in the future. And that has nothing to do with backward time causation or anything ghostly like that. All it's got to have, any organism, is the ability to anticipate very many different reactions rapidly to crisis situations. And that can only be done by having an anticipatory process occurring inside here. It's all good science. There's absolutely no reason why attributing purpose to organisms is non-scientific. That's rubbish.
And by learning too. I mean,
By learning, yes,
one of the
exactly.
crucial things about that enhances anticipation is learning to associate different levels of activity.
Exactly.
Now, in the old days, behaviorists used to treat this as in a reflexive kind of way, associated reflexes and so on, that if you ring bells and things and then stimulate the organism learns to do whatever it needs to do in order to to prevent being electrocuted or whatever it is. Excuse me, the behaviorists wanted to do to them if they didn't press the button or press the lever. And then they started measuring the behavior, the intelligence of the organism, how well it responded in that kind of environment. I mean, if I bung you in a chamber and then give you a lever to pull, and you accidentally pull it one day because you're starving, because you haven't been fed for a whole day and a half or 2 days or 3 days or even a week, and you accidentally press this button, or even just simply sit there as a human being, cogitate a bit and say, I wonder what will happen if I press this button. And you press the button and lo and behold, a peanut arrives or something. I mean, and you go on pressing the button to get the peanut. I mean, is that really a definition of human intelligence? Up to some point, it might be. In the fact that we learn to press things and do things to create and so on. But what we're doing there is reasoning. And it's a curious thing that people want to leave the reasoning out. Oh, it's all reflexive. Well, it isn't all reflexes. I mean, if you look at the way a crow solves the problem of getting food out of a jar of water, and it starts doing it by doing all sorts of creative things. I mean, there was some, extraordinary imaginative things. Like, for example, I mean, it was the person, Denis, who was it? The chap who weighed things by the displacement of water. Remind me again.
Avogadro.
Who?
Are we talking about Avogadro?
I don't know. Anyway, he decided that you could measure things by seeing amount of water that was displaced. Who was the chap that did the eureka thing in the bath, Dennis, wasn't it? A displacement of water. The
I think I may be wrong, but I think that's Avogadro. Yeah.
Well, I can't remember. Anyway, whoever he was, you see, I mean, it's a bit like the crow. I mean, the crow knew that if you could displace the water by putting
Oh yes, that was very clever of the crow. Yes, that's right.
I mean, then the water rises and the thing that's floating in the water gets to the point where it can put its beak in and collect it. Now, indeed, that's a measure of intelligence. Everybody, and it's a reason for the action. Why is the crow doing that? Why
yes, I think what you're getting at, Ray. Yes, sorry, just coming quickly on this. I think what you're getting at is that the learning is unlimited.
Yes.
That's the point. It's no longer reflexive because it's unlimited.
Yes, unlimited associated learning,
Yes,
which is a crucial ingredient of it. So I don't understand why they have such a problem with reason that they would seek to dismiss it as a fundamental of causality. When you look at what we've termed in our little book, Understanding Living Systems, ecological intelligence. Ecological intelligence is precisely that understanding of what is happening in the environment and why. And the why is as important to all organisms as it is to us. If Jack and Jill go up the hill to fetch a pail of water, and I ask you, why did Jack and Jill go up the hill? You might say, because you now know, they went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown. And I ask you, why did Jack fall down? You don't answer that simply by how did Jack fall down? Although you might try, you may say, well, he slipped on a stone and lost his balance. And I might say to you, but what if Jill pushed him? They were playing, having fun, flirting with each other, and she pushed him, and he tripped on a stone and fell down the hill and broke his crown. The only way you can understand that situation is by reason. The reason, and this is the problem, and it's a philosophical problem, no doubt, the reason may be wrong. And what we do with that in practice as organisms is to try and work out the probability of it being wrong. And even then, we may not be right. When we see a chimpanzee pick up a stone, because we have learned that chimpanzees use stones sometimes, not all chimpanzees do this, but groups of chimpanzees use stones to crack nuts. And it's good for them because they can crack nuts that are harder to crack just by their hands alone. And so they find and repurpose stones. They even reshape the stones in order to make them better suited to cracking nuts. They'll even secrete a really good stone so that they can go back to it and use it again when needed. All these are reasons. How can you possibly understand chimpanzee behavior without knowing those reasons? You can't. Now, you may be wrong in your anticipation when you see a chimpanzee pick up a stone and you think, he's going to crack nuts. Well, I may be wrong. He may crack heads with it. He may throw it at you. He may be fed up with you, a silly behaviorist, trying to understand his intelligence by not taking into account the fact that he has reasons for doing things. And the chimpanzee also will look at other chimpanzees, and when they see them picking up stones, they might think also, we're going to crack nuts. But they may have already learned too that sometimes some recalcitrant chimpanzees use it to throw at them and do other things with it. And these are the problem is that it's not easily measurable. It's not easy to know when you're right. And philosophy teaches us that that's true of so many problems. Even the problem of understanding reality in perception is a fundamental one. And unless we understand the difficulties inherent in it, I don't understand how we can be good scientists, as it were. Because science is, to some extent, looking for better ways of measuring the reasons why something happens, or the purpose, or the causes. And if reasons are part of the cause, we need to find ways of seeing how they can be.
Yes, that I think is part of what we were trying to do in one of our articles, Ray. And our tentative solution there is an alignment issue. How is it that the processes occurring here can align out of many behavioral options, which it's already got because it has a huge behavioral repertoire there? How does it align that best with what the social context, as it were, dictates? But we'll use the word dictate carefully. Doesn't mean to say determined, but rather encourages certain ways of acting better than others. And I think it's hard to deny that we align our behavior with our moral and other social convictions. Otherwise, how does a social group hang together? That is part of the social hanging together, and it will be different in different cultures. There are some cultures that forbid kissing in public. There are others that accept it. It's as different as that. And that, of course, would be, let's say, Paris at one end and Japan, Tokyo at the other end. And they will have their own differences on what they regard as it being desirable to align yourself to, but they are necessary because they're allowing that alignment, and
also,
because then there is cohesion.
Yeah, and also the other thing that this leads to is, which I think is significant in what we've been trying to say to people, which is that materialism is not incompatible with free will. Materialism isn't the same as deterministic.
Exactly.
Mechanical system is deterministic. If you look at how clocks work, and the clock works as clockwork, and it does it in ways that it's going to do it. Once you've wound it up, it'll do it. And it's readily predictable because it does it in a deterministic way. But that is not the fundamental of materialism. As we made the point clear earlier, that one of the fundamentals in life is the extraordinary stochasticity. And much of life functions by harnessing that. The very nature of our functioning of our brains, for example, is dependent upon harnessing the stochasticity of ions, different ions within the nerve cells. And also the synapses. There's a huge amount of variability which is harnessed. And when you look at nerves, I was a neuroscientist for many years. I trained as a neuroscientist. I trained as a zoologist and a neuroscientist. And I tell you where, some people might think, well, you were reductionist because you were looking at what individual cells were doing in the nervous system, because I did. I'm quite proud of the fact that I was able to record intracellularly as if this was some grand, like landing on the moon, great kind of achievement. You land inside the cell with an electrode and you record the potential difference across the membrane. And I was doing it with particular kind of cells. I was interested in receptive fields in the skin. How do our somatosensory system, how do we sense the environment in terms of touch? And there were various ideas that we had as the background to what we were looking at. And one of those was that how we locate a stimulus on the skin depended on the lability of the receptive fields of the sensory cells, that they could be those sensory fields, those receptive fields, moment by moment could change in their size, in the area, moment by moment, by using a combination of excitatory and inhibitory processes within the somatosensory system. And so when you record the neurons, you find that this is exactly the case. You map out the receptive field under certain conditions. And then what we did was to see what happens to those receptive fields if you do touch the skin. And if you touch the skin, the receptive fields shrink. And what this does is to enable the system to have greater acuity. And by doing that, it is more able to locate the stimulus on the skin. Now, that doesn't mean that the answer was self-evident in what we were doing by recording the cells. When you record the cells, you pop inside a cell and you hear this terrible waffle going on all the time. Waffle, 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 in sound. We translate the electrical activity in sound. And what all this waffling is are the electrical potentials. And what those electrical potentials are the exchange of ions, of charged particles across the membrane, going waffle, 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 waffle. Sometimes the waffling, waffle, 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 gets closer to what's called the action potential, if you like, the threshold for generating an action potential. And then the cell will generate an action potential, or more likely a burst of action potentials. And you get a different kind of sound, you see. I mean, it's full of sound in terms of what we translate it as. But the point here is that waffling is going on all the time. This is waffling. All this waffle and spurting and splashing is going on in our brain all the time. If you were to monitor what's happening at the synapses, billions of them, billions of synapses going on here all the time, it's waffling. But that waffling is kind of like, it's like having a lump of soggy clay on a potter's wheel, that it can be shaped and changed in response to various states. And in a sense, this goes back to this idea of states as consciousness. What is consciousness? Consciousness is a state of being. It is no more than that. And in a sense, it is far more than that. But because it gives us the ability to sense our own sensing, to be aware of our integrity. Consciousness to me is like a readiness, if you like, to act, and thereby anticipatory. And it goes back to what Denis was saying earlier, that the key thing there is anticipation. It's a state of readiness and anticipating what it is that's going on in the world, regardless of whether we're right about it. We cannot function without that. And that is consciousness. You don't.
That is demonstrated, isn't it, Ray?
Yes.
Just briefly, there are what are called readiness potentials in the nervous system that have been recorded as inevitably what happens when you are in the process of making a decision. It's fascinating. It really is. They are readiness potentials. The system is getting itself geared up, and we feel that consciously too.
It is, well, that is the feeling. That is the consciousness, Denis.
That is the consciousness.
And
Yes,
but I'll say something. I'll say something really highly controversial now. Something that Denis and I have been discussing more recently, and also with other colleagues. I have to say, and a lot of this comes from discussions with a group that we interact with in Edinburgh, or based in Edinburgh, that looks at choices. And the biology of choices in systems and organisms, and obviously anticipation is a vital aspect of choice, because you can't really make it without some anticipation of what the result will be of any decision or action that you take. So there's an enormous amount of anticipation involved in how organisms make choices. But all organisms make choices. And all organisms have states of readiness to make choices. And all organisms, to varying degrees indeed, have an ability to identify self in some kind of functional way. They don't all eat their own backsides, for example, because they recognize the fact that it is self, as it were. Now, they don't do it in a linguistic way like I've just done. They don't use the word self, that's me, and I am who I am. They don't do it linguistically, but we do, and that is another level of doing it. But it doesn't mean that consciousness, as it were, has simply emerged out of that process of doing. One can just as readily see things like readiness and a sense of integrity at very, very low level forms of life. I don't like the word low level. They're extraordinarily complex and have an enormous range of functional capacity. And what we tend to do with the lower forms is to just simply regard them in a robotic, excuse me, in a robotic kind of way, that they just an algorithm could explain their behavior. In large part, yes, indeed. I mean, if you look at a paramecium, it sort of moves forward and bumps into something and then comes back, changes its angle of approach and moves forward. And eventually it gets around the object. That's a kind of intelligence in a way, but they'll say, oh, well, that's just simply an algorithm. When you get very, very complex algorithms that involve a choice between algorithms, how do you choose which algorithm to insert, if you like? And we don't like the idea of inserting an algorithm. I mean, variability isn't just inserted within a various system to create decision making. The variability is existent all the time, throughout, everywhere in the system. It's variability, it's stochastic. The problem is not so much that, the problem is how does the system constrain it? And it leads to what we've called boundary conditions, and the way the boundaries function as molding this stochasticity into reasoned function, objective functionality. But not only do we say that it does that, but we actually say that that definitively is what reason is, if that makes any kind of sense.
What you have to do here, Ray, just to come in briefly on this, what you have to do is to distinguish between the different forms of causation.
Yeah.
Much of it in the social context is causation by form, not by mechanism. And that was a fundamental distinction introduced by Aristotle in his De Anima, 2,000 odd years ago. And that's, again, to come back to dear Richard. I call him dear Richard because I've known him for so long. But, you know, he just ignores this distinction. He just simply says, well, genes are causes. But he doesn't clarify what he means by a cause. I say they are effectively, as sequences, causes of form. It is the form of the sequence that is used to translate into an RNA and then into protein. The DNA itself doesn't do anything about that. It gets read, yes, but it doesn't actually, it is not an active process. And this distinction between active and passive causation is utterly fundamental in physiology. If I measure, for example, the association level between knocking out a particular gene that's responsible for pacemaker rhythm and observe a change in rhythm, maybe 10%. But I also know, as a physiologist that's worked out the full dynamic causation, that the actual contribution can be 80%. The difference between active causation and associative score, which is what the GWAS people are measuring, is fundamental. You can have a GWAS score of 0 and there can still be a huge contribution to causation. It's just that the system is very robust. If one mechanism doesn't work, it uses another one. And that is fundamental here. And it's the reason why most of the GWAS scores are very low. The only ones that are high are the ones that occur for the monogenetic diseases, where everybody would agree that if you've got cystic fibrosis, the genes for that, you'll have cystic fibrosis. Not much you can do about it. But they affect only, roughly speaking, 5% of the population. That's not to deny that that's important to that 5%. It is. But for the great majority, 95% of the association scores are so low that they're almost useless for medical purposes. Does anybody go and take their genome to their doctor? Do I go with a great big book of my CGs, A's and T's and say to my doctor, Joe, could you take a look at this? He would laugh me out of court.
You're touching on something quite important there, Dennis, in the sense that when we consider twin studies, and I think you guys also touched on this on your paper, can reasons and values influence action or how might intentional agency work physiologically, which we'll touch on, because I do want to focus on that macro level causation versus micro level causation, how you're able to bring this up with harnessing stochasticity. But the one thing you guys touch on is the fact that in twin studies, you'll notice how the genome there is fine, prepped, ready to go. However, both twins are not actively getting the same information from the mother's womb. So while one might be receiving a little bit more blood flow, the other one might be receiving a little bit more nutrients, there's there's so much complexity here and so many variables to consider that it's impossible for us to actually just say that you can take a CTA and combine this to have someone produce a certain outcome. It's not fixed. It's very, very variable. Do you want to touch on that, any of you guys?
Well, briefly, from my point of view, the egg cell, of course, is critical in determining which genes get activated initially. It isn't the DNA that determines that. It is the egg cell that has the right mix, if you want to call it right, a mix, let's put it that way, be a bit more neutral, of control molecules, RNAs and transcription factors, which are characteristic of that particular egg cell, which is why I don't think anybody's going to recreate my mother's egg cell as it was in February 1936. It's as simple as that. They're all different. And so the idea that somehow or another you can get away from the contextual form of causation, which triggers the beginning of development, I think is just nonsense. You need to know the initial conditions for the development.
Absolutely.
We don't know. That's a big issue still. It's an open area of physiology that needs more experimentation.
It is an area of physiology that I was also involved in.
Indeed, area.
As well as having been a sensory physiologist, I became a joint director of a fetal and neonatal research group at University College. And one of the things that the group were looking at was the way in which the maternal system influences the developmental choices of the fetal system. And the way the placenta, largely through epigenetic processing, can be changed in order to adapt to different states of nutrition, of maternal nutrition. And the outcomes can be extraordinarily different. And remember that we're dealing with, in a sense, genomes that would be precisely the same other than those early developmental conditions. A group in Southampton have looked at this in terms of human women and looked at this transgenerationally and found that, for example, liver function, which is determined within the womb, the metabolic strategy, if you like, of the developing fetus, dictates the metabolic strategy postnatally and through to adulthood. And that also can be passed on further generationally. Depends very much on the circumstances, but they have found transgenerational changes even within humans. And to me, this was the key evidence to show that there can be acquired characteristics. And many of those acquired characteristics operate when the system is much more open to change. So, and there are certain periods of development when that is the case. One is the developing embryo and the fetus. The other, of course, is during adolescence. And another, curiously, is when we come to older age. This is why I referred to this earlier, the fact that the system adapts differently as an older system. But it is nonetheless a dynamic adaptation. It's not just simply a deterioration. It's taking account of the fact that one's faculties are now, as it were, not as adaptable. And we know that, for example, I suffer tremendously from hypertension, and that's not going to go away, but it can be treated if we know about it. If you see what I mean, what's occurring there physiologically and functionally, and we know also that different different people will have different degrees of that kind of problem as they age. And a lot of that is epigenetically determined, curiously enough, by what happened to you in the womb. And that isn't extraordinary. So working out what's cause and effect depends on the time, the way in which the organism subsequently develops, the range of possible outcomes that can be, for example, produced through exercise and various other things, and all on the basis of the same genome.
Mm. Do you think that it's quite, it would be almost impossible for someone who does consider this to be a deterministic world, that the immeasurable amounts of variables to consider, I mean, it's incalculable. So it's something that at no point we're ever going to be able to do this. So there's almost an arrogance here in assuming that it's possible.
Well, we're never going to be able to do it because it's not too difficult to calculate. That you'd need, for some of these potential computations, like computing the activity of all the water molecules in a single cell, that would require computational power that would probably require most of the material in the solar system to build it. I mean, it's not too difficult to see. Once computational explosion is rampant, as it is in systems made of water, you're never going to be able to do fully molecular level computations. People try. And even computing, let's say, how an iron has its water molecules surrounding it because they're all polar and they will line up like magnets, and how far out this goes and how far you have to go out, and also what state is the water in. There are more than just frozen and fluid. There are many states, as we know from the snowflake issue, in which water can, as it were, form itself. And again, it's an interaction between what is in the water, the proteins, the RNAs, and goodness knows how many metabolites, hormones, and other things, each of which will, in a relativistic way, determine partly what the water is doing. The fact is that it's incomputable at a molecular level. I think it's as simple as that.
There's a very funny thing here that comes about as well, which you see, and obviously, we're physiologists. I'm sorry, another hat. Again, you keep wearing different hats. But it's a very interesting thing that one of the criticisms that we do receive sometimes is the fact that we're not, oh, well, what do you know about evolution? And they also say to us, oh, our mathematics works, our computations work. Well, only because you decided what the end product should be, which is maintaining genes in a gene pool. But once you've done that, yes, you can get a result and show that, well, they behave like this in order to maintain their genes in a gene pool by behaving like that. But our answer to them is, well, we're physiologists and our computations work as well, but they're fundamentally different from your computations.
Exactly. Yes, that's right. Most of the population genetics computations are not dynamic. They're looking for to what will the system tend to go, which is a valid way of looking at things. I don't deny that. But we, as physiologists, are necessarily concerned with how does it move from where it is to where it might go. And that requires dynamic differential equation models.
And also we're concerned as behaviorists, as well as physiologists, with why does it happen.
So,
and again, you need different kinds of computation to understand that. So this idea that there's one way of calculating things and then having a system that works because it works. I mean, we've had this said to us at meetings, that why fix something that isn't broken? Well, we say that's fine. It does what you want it to do. And it gives you an explanation within certain bounds. But it isn't applicable to either the physiology as such, and in terms of purpose for something to occur, I mean, the function of a cell, for example, within a system can be differential within the system. And so you could then say, as a physiologist, the purpose of that cell is to do whatever it's doing. So some cells might be filtering in, say, the relation to the kidney, functions of the renal system. And other cells may be concerned with creating osmotic gradients and so on, you see. But you can identify. This is what's so wonderful about physiology and anatomy. You can see the most beautiful arrangements in order to generate these osmotic gradients, which are how our renal system functions. And then the way it utilizes pumps in order to create these extraordinary gradients. The ways nerve cells generate electrical gradients, which they can then use to generate signals. The way the signals are used in order to generate the release of chemicals held in packets, membrane packets, and quanta that are released at synapses to cause these things. And we as physiologists see those things happening, as it were. And so we understand reason within that context too. And then at the behavioral level, we understand reason in the same way as we were referring to the chimpanzee using a stone to crack nuts. And you don't go into a different realm by doing that. You're talking about the same problem. How do we understand behavior? And we can understand it at various levels. And those levels are interactive in causal functionality. They're not all one way. They're going backwards, forwards, sideways. Some of them are just simply conditional. The beauty, I mean, plants, if you touch them, it can generate this extraordinary calcium transient within the cells of the leaves and so on. And this spreads through the system. And what that does is to create a state of readiness, a preparedness that something is happening. But if you look again at plants, you find that it's actually extraordinarily exquisite, because plants respond in different ways depending on what it is that has touched it. Now, that is amazing. And so you can, in that context, you see, say that the plant responded in this way because it was touched by that organism and not by that kind of organism. There is reason, you see. And you cannot understand that ecological context without understanding the reason. You can't explain it without that. And that's, in a sense, that's all we are saying. And why it is that people get so cross about it, it goes back, I think, fact that they want to have this strange, duality that the one never meets anywhere and can explain the same thing. We're explaining the same thing.
Actually, Ray, it goes deeper, doesn't it, historically? Because once they inserted the Weissman barrier as an absolute barrier, that automatically excluded any physiological influence on the next generation. It's as simple as that. Once you know that that barrier doesn't stop the control processes from influencing the next generation, everything is open again. And you cannot exclude physiology from being part of what determines the direction of evolution. And that's just straightforward. It's, again, coming back to the fundamental molecular biological detail that I outlined earlier. Once you admit that DNA is not a self-replicator, so it cannot replicate accurately independently of the cell itself. In other words, there's no replicator separate from the vehicle. And once you've also abandoned the Weissman barrier, you can no longer exclude physiological processes from having a role in the evolutionary process. Now, I was told many times by Richard in the debate with him 2 years ago, Denis, you're a physiologist, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and the two are not the same. I say, you cannot exclude one from the other. It doesn't, unless you hang on, as it were, at all costs to the Weissman barrier and to self-replication. And neither of those are true.
And it's a beautiful gap if you think about it. A physiologist, and even so, me as a medical doctor, I mean, without physiology bridging that gap, that biological gap to the psychological system, physiology plays the most fundamental role here. It paints a holistic picture. I mean, as you guys, to quote you guys, organisms do not behave as rational calculators.
No, that's right.
A fundamental process.
Indeed. Darwin spent the last 10 years of his life collaborating with the physiologist George Romanes, because he was determined to see whether his idea of, well, he didn't know about the supposed barrier, because that only came in 1883 when he had passed away. But he was clear that there had to be processes that communicate from the soma to the germline. And he spent a lot of time interacting with George Romanes to try to prove that with various hybridizations. What was missing in the 19th century was the knowledge of epigenetics. Once you've got epigenetics, you've got the environment through physiological processes of epigenetic nature controlling the way the genome is interpreted. And it doesn't even need that it should be transmitted by the genome, because culturally it can be transmitted without any bothering with the DNA. And if an environmental change lasts a long time, which is the only environmental change that's of interest evolutionary wise, then so will the epigenetic effects exist for a long time, even if there's no assimilation into the genome. These are fundamental facts, which I'm afraid neo-Darwinist rivals have just simply missed, haven't seen the significance of it. What they will say is, oh, it all dies out after a generation or two. But that's only true if you have a point influence from the environment. If you maintain the environment, it will maintain the epigenetic change. It's so obvious as to hardly need to be expressed.
Another thing I really enjoy is the way you guys have incorporated music into this understanding of life and this beautiful synchronicity of the both of them. Do you want to explore that a bit?
Well, I did that in The Music of Life deliberately, of course, but that was done largely to produce a different metaphor from Richard Dawkins' metaphor of the selfish gene. And so that was its main function. But actually, I've come to think that there's more to it than just an alternative metaphor. What is being synchronized when respiration is synchronized with heartbeat variation? What is being synchronized when the processes of circadian rhythm are synchronized with various hormonal changes? This is all harmonization to varying degrees. I mean, you can argue about what kind of music this might be, and it may not be Bach-like, it may not even be Beethoven-like, it may be more like avant-garde than either of those. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which there almost has to be that kind of resonance across different processes within the body, because it's continually seeking for, well, you might call it the best compromise, because they will all want to go off in different directions. You've always got to have a kind of compromise on what is regulated this much with the kidney function, what is regulated that much with the circulatory system and with the hormonal system and the immune system and so on. And they're all having to be regulated within certain constraints, but not in a terribly deterministic fashion. It's a hunting process.
Hunting.
Again, got the idea of a musical sequence. So I actually come now to think what I used in the Music of Life all those years ago, nearly 20 years ago now, what I used there as just an alternative metaphor to selfish gene has, as it were, got more mileage to it than I thought initially.
Absolutely, Dennis, and in fact, the harmonization, if you like, of the physiology with the behavior is significant in the way in which organisms use music to do that.
Yes.
It's not, it is in itself harmony because organisms harmonize. And it's a curious thing. Whales, for example, I mean, we can think of other kinds of organisms as well, but they sing to each other across huge distances within a pod. I mean, a pod doesn't have to be close proximity to act as a pod. And they communicate with each other by sound, and they will sing essentially to each other. They create phrases, and it's creative process. This is what music does, of course. They create these phrases, and I'm not going to try and mimic one in any event. But what is interesting is that they reply to each other, but also add to the phraseology. Bit like it happens when you get extemporization in music. There's an enormous extemporization going on in behavior in organisms, and that is significant in maintaining the integrative function of the group or the pod or the family or the community or whatever. And I think resonance is a lovely term for it. And it's almost creating that kind of readiness, if you like, for the group to act as a group. So that, for example, when you get a pack of lions hunting as a pack, it's whatever is going on there is in harmony. Each is anticipating the behavior of the other within the pack, within the troop, in their hunting behavior. There will be one that will go for the jugular, as it were, another that will go to the back, another which will hassle at the legs, another that will hassle at some other vital organ system, and so on. And it's extraordinary looking at that harmonious kind of structure within it. And it's a bit like, a major piece of a symphonic work. It's also the case when you look at the opposite too, which is looking at the way the herd behaves to the presence of a troop of lions. There is an alertness, a readiness, a kind of a communication going on between the members of the herd. And the lions also are feeling for which of them is not actually functioning sufficiently well within that harmony. And they will go, if they can, for that stray, because they don't want to risk their lives going up against a massive, great big bull who could harm them. And so first they'll prefer to hunt as a pack if they can, although they will hunt singly. But equally, the herd know that there is a way to defend themselves as a herd. Birds create the most extraordinary shapes and patterns. There's so much that we still don't understand about what is going. Shoals of fish acting as a shoal of fish. It's extraordinarily the case that they are acting as one. And we humans, I think, do it as well, sometimes to a disadvantage in the sense that it's so easy for us to act as a pack, in a sense. It's very alluring. It relieves you of an individual responsibility, of individual fear and hate and so on, and you act as a pack. And as a pack, you can become extraordinarily dangerous. One to each other as well, it seems to me, worries me immensely. I hate being part of herds, if you like. I don't like that herd instinct, but there's something to be learned from it. And I think it's also how politics can influence our behavior in a way as well. We want to be part of a herd. We want to be accepted. And so there's a psychological element to the music as well, Dennis, that is not always as beautiful.
And I see that within this niche of this podcast, when you see the different thinkers, the minds, and you can almost tell once they get into a philosophical mindset or a headspace regarding their theory of consciousness, it's very difficult for them to get out of it. That sort of herd mentality gets you. And then you fight for that value or that belief throughout your entire career, perhaps, without looking back. So it's very interesting to see how this even plays a role within academia, because it's a big part of our lives.
It is indeed, and it's very difficult as an academic. We're trained to be critical, but we're fearful of the criticism. It's a very strange dynamic. There is so, I mean, people often say, why are you saying this now? And it's a damn good question. And I think one of the reasons is because we're free to do so. That freedom doesn't exist for many, many, many academics in different parts of the world. That freedom can be extraordinarily restricted. And as students coming through, they will experience dogma. And they will experience also scientists and academics having to operate within those dogmas. And that is extremely difficult. We find very often that we can be profoundly misunderstood.
Mm.
And our position can be misused, misapplied. We worry about that quite a bit because for the reasons that I've said, which is that not all academics are in a position of freedom, if you like, to critique. But it is all what we are doing, really. I don't think we ever set out to create another dogma, really. I mean, we suffered under dogma. As when genetics gained hold as a primary causal, it was inevitable that money started being diverted to looking for those causes, and looking for the golden bullet, if you like, that was going to help us understand disease in a way that would produce inconceivable solutions to the problems of human health. And it was at the expense of systems work. Because if you do believe that genes are primarily causal, then inevitably politicians in particular are going to look for easy solutions, and they're going to look for, that's where they're going to be best investing their money. We're trying to get across to people that what you need to do in academic life is to fund the thinkers, to critique, to ensure that you've always got people at the edges that are showing that variability, that are challenging the central dogma, if you like, that is prevalent. So we never set out to introduce another dogma. We don't have another dogma. I mean, we have ideas that we hold precious, which is the fact that, I mean, I don't know whether you can call free will a dogma. Maybe you can, but I prefer that dogma because without free will, you can't challenge dogma. So I prefer the dogma of free will to the dogma of determinism.
Mm.
I can ask, I would ask those determinists, if you like, who don't believe in free will and think it's an illusion, I'd ask this question: why are you telling me that? I mean, they're telling me it in order to influence my behavior or my thoughts. They don't like the fact that I really sincerely believe that we have a reasonably large degree of free will. We have to have, otherwise we can't be adaptable enough to survive as humans.
It reminds me, I just posted a clip a few days ago for an interview I had with Noam Chomsky, and I asked him about free will, and he said, everybody, just like Cohen in one of your quotes, says, irrespective of what we believe, everybody acts as if we have freedom of the will. So there's no point in denying freedom of the will because of that. If we're always going to act in this way, then most certainly it doesn't really matter philosophically.
No, and we assume, and we make the assumption that we each have free will. We do that. Of course we do it, because our whole judicial system is based on the fact that people have freedom to act in different kinds of ways. And if you choose to act malevolently, then you're responsible for acting malevolently. Without free will, you wouldn't be responsible for it. I mean, you'd be a self-driving car. And if you had an accident, then you'd have to find something wrong with the machine, rather than the fact that you made a judgment based on your wishes, your hopes and fears and loves and hates. And, you know, and you killed that person because, quite frankly, you didn't like them and you got in your way. And so on. And yet we have strange kind of devices called morals and ethics in behavior, that we shouldn't behave like that. And so we start imposing them as much as possible on each other. And we do that because we know that people do have choices. So yes, I find, I mean, in any case, even if we accepted it as an illusion, it's a fantastic illusion. I'd go with it all the time. I mean, I'd rather have that illusion than not. And what do they mean by an illusion? They mean that it doesn't really exist. But then I go back, why are you telling me this? They're telling me it because they know damn well, actually, that the illusion matters. The illusion is free will. I mean, if it's an illusion, it exists. Okay, I can acknowledge to them, okay, you can have it if you like, call it an illusion. You only happen to call it an illusion because you can't understand how something immaterial can influence something that's material.
I find it fascinating. I see two brothers, and one perhaps looking at a microscope, looking at neural cells, the other one looking at maybe the SA node, looking at all these action potentials in different parts of the body, physiologically, obviously all intertwined at some point. One looking at EEGs, one looking at ECGs. And then somehow you guys managed to almost develop a hive mind together. And it's very inseparable. You can sort of see how one of you can think of something and the other finishes the other person's sentence. Do you guys disagree fundamentally on anything regarding this field?
I don't think we do, because we're never trying to establish a dogma.
I think what we've done is, over a period of, what is it now, getting on for about 20 years of interaction, in a sort of fairly rigorous way, publishing papers together, after all, is pretty rigorous. We've come to hone a lot of our own rough edges in how we interact, but that tells me that you need academic communities that can interact in this kind of way, because that is the way in which we get closer to an analysis which we can defend, because a group of people can think of many more reasons why one might be wrong about something than a single person can. I don't think it's possible to be a really good thinker academically alone. That's my explanation for what has happened. If people interact over a long period of time, there is some kind of honing away of the minor differences that might have existed. And you see it in other communities too. Monastic communities do the same. Well, particularly some traditions like meditative traditions, they're continually hacking away at each other's so-called misperceptions of the world. And they even have sutras to remind them the fact, you think you understand the world? No, you don't. That's the Diamond Sutra. You think you understand the nature of the person? No, you don't. That's the Heart Sutra. And so you can go on with the different ways in which it has been expressed. But there is a strong sense, I think, to how long people interact together, to the process by which you come to be able to finish each other's sentences, because we've, as it were, danced and created a harmonization of the way we think. Now, I think that may be an illusion of another kind. It may be we should have a third person doing this with us, or a fifth, or a sixth, or a 20th, you know, but the group is groupthink matters, is what we're really saying.
It is also the case that if one or other of us comes up with an idea at the boundary, as it were, at the edge, and I mean, one might think, gosh, you know, should I really say that? I mean, should I really go there? I mean, is it too far? we would bounce that off each other in a sense. I mean, you know, and build on it rather than reject it, see where it goes. And if you do that often enough, you begin to understand how the other mind works. It's also the case that we bring to the table completely different experiences.
That's right. Yeah.
And I mean, many people might not know this, might not understand that, because they might think, well, we're the same family, but we had completely different trajectories in life. And those trajectories mattered in what we brought to the table. I mean, I kind of had an introduction to philosophy before I had an introduction to science. I had no idea I'd be a scientist. And I mean, I left school when I was 15. I grew up in a one-parent family on a council estate. And I left school at 15. And my school headmaster said of me in my penultimate school report that he could see no reason, I'm quoting now, no reason why public money should be wasted on the attempted education of this boy.
That's harsh.
So you see, I left school. Well, I couldn't see any reason either. And I certainly didn't want to stay there because they couldn't see in me the potential. Actually, to be fair, I mean, there were one or two of them, my teachers, who could. So I left school, and I left school very young. I did not know then that I would become an academic. I certainly didn't know I would become a scientist of any kind. My first interests were in politics, philosophy, and economics. When I say my first interests, because that's not quite true. I mean, you know, as they developed, my instinct was to tend towards philosophy, actually. And at one time, I thought I might study, if I could get into university. In those days, it was back in the 1960s and so early 70s, and it was extremely difficult to get into university. If you'd left school in the circumstances I left in, very few people in the United Kingdom went to university. About 6%, a very tiny percentage of those that had qualifications went to university. I mean, we hadn't experienced then the sort of massive expansion in higher education, which is wonderful, incidentally. You know, the more we have higher education, the better it seems to me, as long as it's doing the right thing, which is creating people who think and are willing to think outside the box and protect them, because that's one of the other crucial things about universities. So I was outside the box, really physically outside the box for a long period of time. And for some reason, I started reading Karl Popper, for example, which in a sense was one of my early introductions to science, because I was fascinated by his approach to scientific thinking and methodology and conjectures and refutations and so on. And how did we unravel problems? But I was also fascinated by his concepts of open society, of open systems. I didn't know then, incidentally, that what he was going on to say was very similar to the kinds of things that we were saying. I had no idea then. I don't think even he had any idea then. When I was back in the 1960s, you see, late 60s. And I started reading that. So I came at this, in a sense, primed with an interest in philosophy rather than with science. When I eventually went to university in the 1970s, I went to study zoology. And the reason for that was because I got so fascinated and wanted to understand how living systems worked. But I came to it, you see, because I felt the need to do that. I needed to understand it. It wasn't so much that I had necessarily a love of zoology or whatever. It's just I wanted to understand how this system worked. And when I did so, when I started studying zoology at Manchester University, this was at the very moment when things were beginning to pivot towards a more gene-centric view. And I saw more behavior being explained by maintaining genes in gene pools and so on. I actually, even as a student, repeated some of Richard Dawson's experiments that he did when he was doing his PhD. And not long after, he actually had done them and so on. Looking at bird behavior and things. And pecking regimes and things, and interpreting everything in terms of peck, 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 changing angle, peck, 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 all very algorithm driven, you see. And this dissatisfied me inherently, because one of the reasons I'd gone in to study living systems is because I wanted to really understand reason. Why did they behave like that? Why did they make that decision? How do they make decisions? And, because I'd come at it from a completely different angle, if you like. So what I'm saying is, and I'm very short, try and shorten what I'm saying after giving a time, we didn't come to each other by sitting around a family table. I mean, in the end, we did, as it were, but we didn't. It wasn't a natural sort of thing that.
Right. And curiously, while you were encountering the gene-centric explanations in Manchester University, I was examining Richard Dawkins' thesis.
Yes.
It's a strange interweaving of one thing after another.
Dennis, at that, what was yours like? What did you bring to the table, and at what point did you guys sort of come together and coalesce in such a beautiful way?
It is the last decade or two that has really seen the coming together flourish. But there have been other things that encouraged it. We both like music. We both even sing and play guitars. We both have acquired also through creating a music group together an interest there too. And so it's a complex pas de deux, as it were. It's a dance, and it's had many aspects which have come together the more it's gone on. I think that's the best way I can describe it. But as Ray said earlier on, our initial trajectories were miles apart. There was no foreseeing what was going to happen.
There were one or two events that one might look back on. I mean, one was a debate that just shortly after Selfish Gene was published at Balliol College. And I came all the way down from Edinburgh. By that time, I was now starting to do my PhD in Edinburgh. And I came all the way down from Edinburgh to Oxford to this debate. And I think it was Anthony Kenny, wasn't it, Dennis? I think it was part of that debate. And you were chairing it.
Taylor with the two philosophers, and Anthony Kenny was absolutely brilliant. He asked Richard, after he'd presented his case for the selfish gene and his theory, said, "Look, I want to know the following. If all I knew of the English language was its alphabet, I would not be entitled and would not be able to understand Shakespeare." Now, I was listening very carefully as I was chairing this meeting, and Richard then said, "Well, I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a scientist, I'm only interested in truth." And that lost him from my point. That was the break point. I don't think he knows that, but I broke with him there, because what Tony, as a philosopher, was getting at is that if all you know is the sequence, you cannot know its meaning. I happen to have almost fluent reading of Hangul script, which is Korean script, but I don't have a command of Korean language, and I would never be able to understand a play or a poem in Korean without a considerable amount of explanation. And that illustrates the point. And he missed the point. He didn't even see what Tony was getting at.
And I did. And
Yes.
That was so influential on my own thinking about all this. It just resonates in my mind just listening to Anthony Kenny make that point. And then the surprise and shock at Richard's reply.
Yes.
To it. I then later experienced a similar kind of dismissal of philosophy. To me, that was an example of how philosophical thinking can be so helpful in unraveling a problem. Because there's a facility of saying that something is like something, and then saying, but wouldn't you say this about that, as it were? And it's that preciseness that I found it very impressive, and I thought it just so fundamentally destroyed the notion of the gene-centric view. And so it was very influential. That's so curiously, if you like, you probably discovered something very interesting here, which is that I think that meeting at Balliol was significant and was probably the germ of what subsequently came to be our sort of collaboration.
That could well be, Ray. That's a good point, and it's come out of this particular discussion.
Yeah,
exactly. So it's served a very useful purpose for us too. But I have to say, I'm beginning to watch the clock because I was lecturing all day today, and I've been going since about 5 o'clock this morning. There are even limits to what philosophers and scientists can do. So we're in your hands, Tevin. How are you going to wrap this up?
I was just enjoying listening to you guys reminisce. It was beautiful. Sorry, guys, I got caught up in the motion there as well. Okay, let's wrap this up a little, guys. The one thing I wanted to ask just before we close is, I was speaking to Professor Terence Deacon and Michael Levin recently about teleodynamics and teleophobia within science and philosophy. A lot of philosophers and scientists hate talking about this.
They hate it. They absolutely hate it, yes.
On the purpose, meaning of this universe, of life, and final thoughts from your side, Dennis, and then Ray, you can end as well.
Just briefly, the break occurred between Wallace and Darwin way back in 1866. Darwin was utterly shocked when Wallace decided he would go on a different route completely from Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was working on his idea that the peacock was really trying to impress the peahen, and that was an intentional, conscious choice. It's in the 1871 book. I quoted almost verbatim from it. Wallace went off in the opposite direction and said, no, Charles, natural selection explains everything. Full stop. That's the break. That's where purpose was eliminated.
And I have one statement to add to that, which is I don't think you can fully understand life by excluding reason. And I think that is such an important ingredient. We tend to dismiss. I remember a discussion. I won't say names. With a colleague who was shocked by my interest in philosophy and by my interest in the significance of psychology. We create our niche as well as adapt to it. All organisms do that. Niche creation is a fundamental in the way life works. A major part of that is the psychological aspect. We've referred to some of it in terms of the way things work in synchrony, the way things work in harmony, and so on. That is so significant to our well-being, to our health and well-being, and understanding how things can go wrong with the system, with health consequences, that if we eliminate reason, it leaves a void of understanding for humans to cope with what it is they're having to cope with, which is this extraordinarily difficult psychosocial environment that we have to be adapted to and adaptable within. And that is increasingly difficult because it changes so rapidly that we find it harder and harder to find the normative within which we're going to work. Ethically, this is extremely difficult for us. Because as we gain more reason, more understanding, if you like, the more we challenge those very things that constrain our behavior, constrain us at that psychosocial level, and provide grounding, if you like, things that we don't have to question or, accept as given. And those things that are accepted as given are now becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, which makes it very hard, I think, for people to be so easily grounded. And that creates a psychological problem. So it's no surprise to me that so many people experience, certainly in the Western world, so many people experience some kind of mental problem in life at some point, have some kind of breakdown, even whether they don't realize it. I mean, I think many people go through mental health issues without realizing that that's been a major problem to them. Having stable relationships becomes harder and harder. And working with others becomes difficult too. So it matters. Reason matters. So the psychology, that level, if you like, that psychosocial level of causation is so significant, particularly in an organism like us that uses it linguistically. We use it to express ourselves, to understand ourselves. Our dependence on cultural transmission of information is as strong as our dependence on anything that might be regarded as genetic. Who we are, our identity matters. So sometimes that is challenged. It can breed hate, or it can breed love. It can breed create all sorts of problems. And so maintaining integrity within that psychosocial, I'm going to call it space, but really I'm not wanting to create a kind of dichotomy like that. But this psychosocial space, it can be extraordinarily difficult. And it's a challenge, I think, to humanity. And at the political level, it's a challenge, because I think that we are getting to the point where even in what we say to each other, we can challenge the foundations of it in terms of reality in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have done in the past. So what is truth becomes a fundamental question. And that's I think perhaps a nice point to end. It's a philosophical question, but curiously, it's a fundamental. I mean, what is truth on social media, for heaven's sake?
Yeah, it's the relativistic view of it all, and the way people are approaching this becomes very, very fishy territory at this point. But gentlemen, this has been such a pleasure for me. Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to chat to both of you. Big fan of both of your works for many years, and I hope that in the future we can discuss and dissect certain papers and books in detail and like focus and hone in to specific topics. And it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Been a terrific host, Tevin.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Well, you've made us think of some things that we probably hadn't focused on.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, guys.
Okay.